Stories are supposed to be written by the living, but some write themselves. Tonight, on Celtic Otherworld Horror Stories, we turn the page on a tale not yet lived, about a manuscript that knows your name, and a farmhouse that remembers its authors, even the ones that vanished. You're about to hear That Way Lies Madness. Like, subscribe, share the story before it writes you in. And if you've been here before, welcome back. You always come back.
The storm had passed, but the air still clung with that dampness you can feel in your bones. The fields outside the farmhouse were slick with rain, the sky an iron gray, stretching endlessly toward the sea. I'd been here a week now, long enough to recognize the unnatural silence that settles over the land after dark. A silence that seemed to breathe, to listen, to wait. But for what? I'd been here long enough to know I wasn't alone. It started with the book. I had come to Wales looking for isolation. After the publishing disaster in New York, my plagiarism scandal that wasn't actually plagiarism, just a vindictive former professor with connections, I needed to disappear. My agent suggested this sabbatical. Go somewhere remote, she'd said. Write something brilliant. Come back when everyone's forgotten. They wouldn't forget, but I had to try. The old stone farmhouse, with its slate roof and windows that rattled in the wind, seemed perfect. Perched on the edge of a cliff overlooking the Irish Sea, it was a 20-minute walk to the nearest village, a place so small it barely registered on maps. No cell service. Spotty internet that failed entirely when it rained. Just me, my laptop, and the book I planned to write about Welsh folklore. I was excited to get into stories of changelings, of doors in hillsides that led to other worlds, of creatures that stole faces and voices. I'd spent the morning in the farmhouse's small study, a room cluttered with old maps, loose pages of handwritten notes, and stacks of brittle newspapers. The previous tenant, whoever they had been, had left behind a wealth of research, much of it centered around the actual folklore I'd come to study. The letting agent had been vague about the last occupant. Academic type, she'd said, not meeting my eyes. Didn't stay long. I was grateful for the abandoned research. This was the very reason I had come, to write my own book on the forgotten stories of Wales and to forget about Daniel. No, I wasn't going to think about him. But I hadn't expected to find the manuscript. It sat alone on the desk, a leather-bound volume without a title. The cover was smooth, as if well handled over the years, but when I opened it, the pages were crisp and unstained. The handwriting inside was dense and hurried, a script that was eerily familiar, not unlike my own. The first page held no author's name, no date, just the beginning of a story. It told of a woman who had also come to this farmhouse, seeking solitude to write, just as I had. She had found the locals wary, reluctant to speak of the land. She had begun to hear voices in the walls, whispers threading through the wood, speaking in a language she could almost understand. And then she had met a man in the woods, a man without a face. The woman's name was Claire Reed, an American writer, just like me. She had come in the spring, just like me. She had slept in the same bedroom, worked at the same desk. A sharp chill ran through me as I turned the pages. Claire's descent was recorded in agonizing detail. The shifting reflections in her mirror, the way the farmhouse seemed to stretch itself at night, the dreams of the tide pulling her deeper, deeper. The faceless man had called to her in her sleep, and one night she had followed. The prose was beautiful, haunting, familiar in a way that made my skin prickle. I reached the final page, my breath tight in my throat. My name was written there, my full name, Eliza Morgan, in the same hurried script. I blinked, but it was still there, followed by the words, "You are next." My pulse thundered in my ears. I stared at the page, willing it to change, for the ink to bleed away, for this to be some trick of the light. But the words remained. The ink looked fresh, as if it had been written moments ago. "This isn't real," I said aloud, my voice unnaturally loud in the quiet room. "This is a prank. Someone had to know I was coming." But who would know? I had told no one where I was going except my agent. The letting agency didn't even know I was a writer. I'd said I was a photographer, working on a collection of Welsh landscapes. I slammed the book shut and shoved it away. My hands were trembling. The study seemed smaller now, the walls pressing inward, the ceiling heavier. I needed air. I grabbed my coat and stepped outside. The village was a mile's walk from the farmhouse, a cluster of houses perched on the edge of the land, watching the restless sea. As I entered, I felt the weight of eyes on me. The old man at the post office hesitated when I approached. The barmaid at the pub kept glancing toward the window, as if expecting something to appear from the mist. I found the village historian, a woman in her 70s with sharp blue eyes, seated in the back of the local shop sorting through old photographs. "Mrs. Hughes?" I approached cautiously. The shopkeeper had directed me to her when I asked about the history of the farmhouse. She looked up when I mentioned the book, her hands went still. "No such book exists," she said. I hesitated. "I found it in the farmhouse." "Then you should leave it there." I swallowed. The last page had my name on it. Her gaze darkened. "It's chosen you, then." The room felt suddenly colder. "What do you mean?" She exhaled slowly, as if weighing how much to say. "I knew a woman once, an American, Claire Reed. She came here to write a book much like yourself. One night she vanished." The air between us grew heavy. Vanished? Left everything behind, passport, coat, didn't even take her bags, her money. Just walked out into the night and was never seen again. A memory stirred in me, the barman's words from my first night here. Last tenant left in the middle of the night, never came back for her things. I gripped the edge of the counter. "What does this have to do with the book?" Her lips thinned. "Stories that aren't written yet have a way of writing themselves. If you see your name in that book, then you were always meant to be in it." "This is absurd," I said, but my voice lacked conviction. "Someone is playing a trick on me." Mrs. Hughes reached beneath the counter and pulled out a yellowed newspaper. The headline was small, relegated to a corner of the front page. "American writer missing, feared drowned." There was a photograph. Claire Reed had my height, my build. Her hair was darker, her face more angular, but there was a similarity that made my stomach twist. "That was 30 years ago, Mrs." Hughes said quietly. "But she wasn't the first. There was a man before her, a poet, and before him a woman who painted. Always creative types, always strangers." A chill crawled up my spine. "What happened to them?" "The locals say they went to the standing stones on the cliffs. There's a circle of them, half fallen now, a mirror to one they say was in the sea. They date back to before written history. They say the stones are a door, that sometimes that door opens." "A door to where?" My voice was barely audible. Mrs. Hughes met my eyes. "To whatever wrote the book." I barely remembered leaving the shop, barely noticed the walk back to the farmhouse. The mist had thickened, coiling between the trees. By the time I reached the front door, the sky had darkened with the promise of another storm. Inside, the house was silent. I avoided the study. Instead, I locked the book inside the desk drawer, refusing to look at it again. I spent the afternoon packing my belongings. I'd leave tomorrow, I told myself. First thing in the morning, go back to New York, face whatever was waiting there. Anything was better than this. But as I was folding a sweater, I found a sketch tucked into the sleeve. It was a drawing of the standing stones Mrs. Hughes had mentioned. The paper was weathered, the ink faded, but the image was clear. 7 stones in a rough circle, with a larger stone at the center. The standing stones were depicted with strange patterns carved into them. They were swirling, hypnotic designs that seemed to move when looked at directly. I hadn't put the sketch there, I was certain of it. I dropped it, backing away. The room suddenly felt too crowded, as if someone else were there with me, watching, waiting. Night came quickly. The storm returned, rain lashing against the windows, wind screaming through the eaves. I retreated to my bedroom, locking the door behind me. But that night, the whispers returned. I woke to the sound of them, a thread of voices weaving through the walls. The words were indistinct, but I could feel their meaning pressing against my skull. I reached for my phone, but the battery was dead again. It had been fully charged when I went to bed. A floorboard creaked outside my room. I held my breath, listening. Then another step. Someone was inside the house. I sat up slowly, my pulse hammering in my throat. The door to my bedroom was shut, but a shadow pooled beneath it. A shape shifted on the other side. I grabbed the lamp from the bedside table and moved toward the door. The handle was cold beneath my palm. I wrenched it open. The hallway was empty, but the book was on the floor. The desk drawer was open. I knew I had locked it. My breath came in short, sharp bursts as I knelt and picked up the book with shaking hands. The pages had changed. New words had appeared in the same hurried script. It described what had just happened, waking to the whispers, hearing the footsteps opening the door. The final line read, "You are reading this now." A sound rose in my throat, somewhere between a gasp and a sob. I slammed the book shut and bolted for the fireplace, hands shaking as I threw it into the cold hearth. My fingers fumbled with the matches, striking one, then another, until a flame caught. The fire licked at the leather cover, curling the pages, turning them black. I watched as the book collapsed inward, consumed by the heat. The relief was short-lived. A breath of cold air swept through the room, snuffing out the fire instantly. And when I turned back toward the desk, the book was sitting there, untouched, open to a new page. My own handwriting, ink still wet. Tomorrow, the faceless man will come. The candle on the desk flickered. A shadow passed the window, just beyond the reach of the light. Waiting. Morning came with a stillness that felt like anticipation. The book remained where I had left it, open to that terrible prediction. I couldn't bring myself to touch it. Instead, I finished packing, moving with the frantic energy of someone running from a wildfire. I didn't bother with breakfast, didn't pause to look at the view one last time. I just needed to get out, get away. I was at the door, keys in hand, when there was a knock. 3 soft taps, barely audible above the sound of the wind. I froze, staring at the wooden door as if it might dissolve. The knock came again, more insistent. "Who's there?" I called, my voice embarrassingly small. No answer. I set down my suitcase and approached the door cautiously. Through the small window beside it, I could make out a figure, tall, wearing what looked like a long coat. But the glass was warped, distorting the image. "What do you want?" I asked. The figure shifted slightly. A hand rose, beckoning. I moved closer to the window, trying to make out the face beneath the hood of the coat. But where features should have been, there was only a blur, a smudge of shadow. The faceless man. My blood turned to ice water. I stumbled backward, knocking over a side table. The vase that had been resting on it shattered on the floor. The knocking stopped. The figure at the door remained still, as if listening. Then, slowly, it turned and walked away, moving toward the path that led to the cliffs, to where the standing stones would be. I watched until it disappeared into the mist. My breathing gradually slowed. I turned back to my suitcase, determined to leave before anything else could happen. But the book was there, resting on top of my packed clothes, open to a new page. "You will follow him to the stones." "No," I said aloud, "I won't." I grabbed the book and hurled it across the room. It hit the wall and fell open, pages splayed. I stormed over to it, ready to tear it apart, and found myself staring at a sketch of Claire Reed. It was expertly rendered, capturing a woman in her 30s, with intense eyes and a thoughtful expression. Below it was another sketch, of a man with wild hair and haunted eyes. Then another woman, this one older, her face lined with determination. I turned the page. The sketches continued, face after face, going back through the decades. All of them shared a quality I couldn't quite name, a look in their eyes that spoke of vision, of seeing beyond the visible world. And on the final page was a sketch of me. Not as I was now, but as I would be. Older, changed. My eyes held the same quality as the others, that same otherworldly awareness. Beneath it was written a single line: "All stories need an author." I slammed the book shut, gasping. This couldn't be real. None of this could be real. But when I looked up, the faceless man was standing at the window, watching. Not knocking this time, just waiting. I blinked, and he was gone. But I could feel him still, calling me. Not with a voice, but with something deeper, a pull like gravity, like the tide. I needed to understand. I needed to see the stones. Against every instinct for self-preservation, I left the house and followed the path to the cliffs. The mist parted as I walked, revealing glimpses of the sea below, churning and dark. The wind carried whispers that might have been voices, might have been waves. The standing stones were visible from a distance, There were 7 weathered monoliths arranged in a rough circle, with a larger stone at the center, just like the sketch. They stood at the edge of the cliff, overlooking the relentless sea, and the faceless man was waiting among them. He stood by the central stone, his form somehow both solid and insubstantial, like smoke given temporary shape. As I approached, I realized what had appeared to be a coat was actually a cloak, ancient and worn, moving in a wind I couldn't feel. Where his face should have been was a shifting void, a darkness that hurt to look at directly. He held out a hand. In it was the book, my book, the one I had come to write. "I don't understand," I said, my voice carried away by the wind. He spoke, though he had no mouth. The words seemed to form directly in my mind. All stories need an author, but all authors need a story. I stared at the book in his hand. "What happens if I take it?" "You write the story that has always been waiting for you, the story only you can tell. And if I don't?" The void where his face should be seemed to deepen. "Then someone else will, but the story must be written." I thought of Claire Reed, of all the others who had come before. Had they stood here too, faced with the same choice? Had they taken the book or had they turned away? "Why me?" I asked. "Because you see what others do not. Because you hear the whispers between words. Because you know that all stories are true somewhere." The standing stones began to hum, a low vibration that I felt in my bones. The central stone, taller than the others, started to shimmer, its surface becoming translucent. Beyond it I could see something else. Not the sea, not the sky, a place of impossible geometry, of colors that had no name. "The door is open. Will you step through?" The faceless man extended the book toward me. I realized then that this was what had happened to Claire Reed, to all the others. They had been offered the same choice. They had taken the book and stepped through the door. "If I go," I asked, "will I come back?" "Not as you are now, but all who write are transformed by what they create." The wind rose around us, the humming of the stones growing louder. The door in the central stone pulsed, calling to me. I thought of my life before. The scandal, the shame, the sense that I had failed at the one thing I was meant to do. I thought of the empty apartment waiting for me in New York, the pitying looks from colleagues, of friends, the whispers behind my back. And I thought of the book, the story that only I could tell. I reached out and took it from his hand. The weight of it was surprising. It was heavier than it looked, solid and real. The cover was warm to the touch, almost alive. "What do I do now?" I asked. "Right." The faceless man stepped aside, revealing the doorway fully. Through it, I could see landscapes impossible to describe, worlds beyond imagination. I opened the book. The first page was blank, waiting. I took a pen from my pocket. Had it been there before? I couldn't remember, and wrote the first line. The storm had passed, but the air still clung with that dampness you can feel in your bones. The words shimmered on the page, then sank into it, becoming part of the book itself. I looked up at the doorway, at the worlds beyond, and I stepped through. The farmhouse stood empty once more, the silence settling back into its corners, into the spaces between the walls. The desk in the study was cleared of papers, of maps, of the laptop that had sat there unused. But the book remained, waiting on the surface, waiting for the next author to arrive. 3 months later, a car pulled up to the farmhouse. A young woman got out, her face tired, her eyes haunted. She carried a single suitcase and a laptop bag. The letting agent handed her the keys with a forced smile. "It's all yours for as long as you need. Very private, very quiet, perfect for writing." The woman nodded, looking up at the windows, at the slate roof. "Has anyone lived here recently?" she asked. The agent's smile faltered. "Not for a while, no. The last tenant left, unexpectedly." The woman frowned slightly, then shrugged. "Well, it's just what I need. Some peace and quiet to finish my book." "What's it about? Your book?" The woman looked toward the cliffs where the standing stones were just visible through the mist. "It's about a writer who finds a manuscript that tells her own story before she's lived it." The agent's face paled. "Sounds interesting." The woman smiled, already moving toward the door. "I think it will be." Inside, the book waited on the desk, its leather cover unmarked, its pages ready. The first line was already written. The storm had passed, but the air still clung with that dampness you can feel in your bones.
The story ends here. Or perhaps it begins again. Some tales aren't told, they're remembered. Some names aren't given, they're written. If you heard whispers tonight, if your name feels heavier now than when we began, then the book has found you too. Leave a mark before you go. Like, subscribe, share the story. And if you dream of cliffs, of stones, of voices in the floorboards, mind the doors. They mind you.